Welcome, this is Anna, and we're going to be starting up on our discussion of the autonomic nervous system. This particular video is going to go over part 1, where we're going to introduce the autonomic nervous system, but then also talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. All right, let's go ahead and start talking about our autonomic nervous system. So, first of all, it is part of your peripheral nervous system. And from now on, I'm going to abbreviate that as PNS, just like I abbreviated autonomic nervous system as ANS. Okay? Now, with everything, you've got a motor division and you've got a sensory division. Primarily, we're going to be talking about this motor division of the nervous system. Yes, there is a sensory component for autonomic structures because everything needs to bring sensory stimulus back to the central nervous system. But for the most part, what we're going to be discussing now in terms of structure is going to be the motor component. So this is the motor component of the peripheral nervous system that is autonomic. Okay. Now, with these motor neuron cell bodies of autonomic neurons, all right, those are going to be located within the anterior horn of your spinal cord. Okay, so preganglionic neurons that are autonomic and motor, their cell bodies are going to be located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord, just like the somatic neurons' cell bodies, okay? The sensory neurons that are autonomic, all right, remember they are also going to go through and work with the posterior horn. I'm going to abbreviate spinal cord. Actually, I'll just write it out. Spinal cord. Okay, it's just like the somatic sensory neurons. All right, so same pattern. The reason you've got the same pattern is because, remember, most things are mixed nerves. So both autonomic and somatic are running together, interacting with their nerves, interacting with the spinal cord in the same way. Okay, now for the autonomic nervous system, it's going to be specializing in serving viscera and other involuntary organs of the body. Okay, so it'll be both visceral effectors, visceral reflexes. Examples would be anything that has smooth muscle in it, that's going to be autonomic. All of your glands are going to be autonomic. The heart, which is cardiac muscle, is also going to be autonomic. All right, so those are some examples of structures. So what does it do? All right, it's going to regulate things like blood pressure, BP, all right, CO for cardiac output, all right, your blood glucose levels. It's also going to do all of your blood vessels, and it's going to control whether they do vasoconstriction or vasodilation, which is also why, also one of the things affecting is control of blood pressure. And then, of course, hormones, you know, the secretion of hormones. All right, let's look at a diagram that I've put into your PowerPoint real quick. What I've done here is I've basically divvied up the voluntary somatic comparison with the autonomic. So I'm still looking at motor divisions. Okay, we're going to focus on that. And you can see the contrast between the two different muscle types. Okay, here it's telling you I've got one motor neuron in the central nervous system. Over here I've got a combination of two motor neurons working together between the central nervous system and the effector organ. We'll look at pictures of that in a little bit. Skeletal muscle is going to be using acetylcholine, but if the autonomic nervous system, depending on what type of division you're working with, whether it's parasympathetic or sympathetic, you will either use acetylcholine or norepinephrine, okay? Which means somatic is always excitatory, but depending on what you've got, what neurotransmitter you're using and what kind of receptor you have, it can be excitatory or inhibitory. The other thing that's different about the autonomic nervous system is that you're going to be using ganglia to protect the cell bodies of motor neurons in the peripheral nervous system. Okay? All right, let's kind of do a drawing of how this all works out. All right, so let's look at the relay between sensory and motor neurons for your voluntary nervous system. So if we're looking at the voluntary, I've already misspelled that, voluntary nervous system, all right? So this is the somatic side, okay? You're going to have some kind of sensory stimulus, and you're going to have the receptor of the sensory neuron that's going to come over here. And remember that this is going to be a unipolar neuron. So this is a lovely unipolar sensory neuron. All right, there it is. And then remember, you've got the dorsal root ganglion right there. Okay, and then it's coming into the spinal cord, which I'm not going to draw. All right, this is the axonal terminal. Okay, and then it's going to synapse with the motor cell body. And we're just going to make a note that it's in the anterior horn of your spinal cord right now. And then that axon is going to leave out the ventral root, and it's going to come over here to an effector organ, and it's going to cause a muscle contraction or something, okay? So that's your basic relay for voluntary. Now, if we look at involuntary, so we're going to look at the autonomic side, so the autonomic nervous system, we're going to be dealing with more than two neurons, okay? We still have our stimulus, and we've got our sensory neuron right here, all right, and it's going to go into the spinal cord. There's the cell body. Here is I'm just going to abbreviate this DRG for dorsal root ganglion. It is now in the posterior horn, and it's going to synapse with the first motor neuron, all right? That's going to leave through the anterior horn into the ventral root, all right, and then out into a spinal nerve. And then it's going to go into another ganglion. And we're just going to call this a peripheral ganglion because it's outside of the central nervous system and it's not a dorsal root ganglion, okay? And there it's going to synapse with the second motor neuron. And then that is going to go to the effector organ and cause a smooth muscle contraction or cause something else to happen. I don't know. So here, this is my sensory neuron. What am I doing? Sensory neuron. We would call this neuron here the preganglionic axon. So that's the preganglionic axon for the motor division, okay? Notice that the cell body, the preganglionic cell body, is located right there. Okay, then you've got the preganglionic axon. These are typically thin and lightly myelinated. Okay, and then right here we have the cell body of the postganglionic axon. All right, and then here is the axon of the postganglionic axon. So this is the postganglionic axon. Again, also thin, sometimes very, very thin, but these tend to be unmyelinated, not always, but this is kind of a typical pattern. So this is unmyelinated, where this one is myelinated. Okay? All right. Now, remember over here, the preganglionic cell body, keep in mind, it's in the central nervous system, whereas this cell body is in a peripheral ganglion. Okay, that's another component to keep in mind. All right? All right, let's look at a picture. So you've got your basic layout. Now we're going to look at a picture. Now, I want you to pay attention to how I drew this. This is something that you should be doing in your notes, drawing this out and practicing it until you can do it from memory. All right, this is a nicer drawing than what I can do. So it's going to do a compare and contrast of the autonomic versus the somatic. You're going to be paying attention to what division it is, sympathetic or parasympathetic, the length of the pre- and postganglionic axons, where the ganglion is located, what neurotransmitter is used, what is the effect, and where does it originate, the preganglionic neuron, where does it originate in the central nervous system? All right, let's look at the somatic one first. So here you've got your cell body. This is going to be up in your spinal cord, all right? It's got a axon coming out that is heavily myelinated. So that's something you're paying attention is to that heavy myelination. And you're going to come over here and at its effector organ, it's going to secrete acetylcholine, and its target is skeletal muscle, and it's going to excite it, okay? Now right here, we're looking at the autonomic nervous system. Now we're going to divide it into parasympathetic right here versus sympathetic right here. Let's do parasympathetic first because it's a little bit simpler. Now, its origin for the cell bodies of the preganglionic axon is craniosacral. So cranial means up in the brain. Sacral means the sacral region of your spinal cord, at the very, very tip of it, okay? Now, its preganglionic axon is long, so pay attention to that. Long preganglionic axon. It is lightly myelinated. It's going to go to a ganglion right here, and it's going to secrete acetylcholine. That stimulates the postganglionic axon, which is not myelinated, and that's going to secrete acetylcholine. Depending on what the target organ was, it can be excitatory or inhibitory. All right, now let's look at the sympathetic. Cell bodies, they are going to be located in the thoracic and lumbar regions of your spinal cord, okay? Their preganglionic axons are going to be short, so you can see right here, short and short, okay? The postganglionic axon is long for most of these and irrelevant for the second type. Both of them at the first synapse secretes acetylcholine to stimulate either the postganglionic axon or the postganglionic neuron or the medulla of the adrenal gland. Then the postganglionic neuron is going to come here. It's going to secrete norepinephrine, which can excite or inhibit depending on the target organ. With this one right here, we need sympathetic stimulation going to the adrenal gland. You'll study the adrenal gland more in A&P2, but basically you have an outer cortex of epithelial cells that make hormones, but the inner core is actually modified neural tissue, so it's neurons inside there. And those neurons make and secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the acetylcholine stimulates these neurons to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, which then goes directly into the bloodstream and circulates throughout the body and also can excite or inhibit depending on the target organ. Okay. Now, you've heard of the word adrenaline. okay? So adrenaline comes from adrenal gland, all right? But we don't want to be calling these things adrenaline and noradrenaline. We want to call them by their correct names, epinephrine and norepinephrine. All right? Let's do some compare and contrasts. All right, well, as usual, I've got a bunch of note slides, but we're going to ignore those for right now. You've got note slides in your PowerPoints. You can always use those. Let's try to kind of set up a compare and contrast between parasympathetic and sympathetic. And then your goal is to rewrite this 10 times until you've got it memorized, okay? So in terms of effect, the way I keep the two straight is I think of parasympathetic as your normal, everyday stuff, and I think of sympathetic as either fight, flight, freeze, or the escalator. All right, it escalates things, okay? So normal, maintenance, chill, everything's good, tranquilo, all good, all right? You're gonna conserve energy over here as well, okay? Another way to kind of think of these is that typically when you use your parasympathetic division, the way it's delivering its stimulus is keeping things localized and giving very specific effects. In contrast, sympathetic tends to be broad across the body, all right, because it can circulate through the bloodstream if it's coming from the adrenal gland. So it's all going all over the place, and it can have a very mixed effect, all right? A lot of different things can happen. All right, now another thing that I think about is the origin of the preganglionic neuron, okay? With the parasympathetic, it's going to be a cranial, oh God, I can't write. A craniosacral origin. So it's going to originate up on the brain or in the sacral region of your spinal cord. Whereas with sympathetic, it's going to have a thoracolumbar origin of your spinal cord. Okay? Now, so that's another thing that you can compare and contrast. Okay? The next thing you can compare and contrast is the location of the peripheral ganglion. Okay? With the parasympathetic, it's going to be near the effector organ. Okay? But with the sympathetic, it's nearer to the spinal cord. Okay? Now that has a very direct effect in that this one is going to have a short preganglionic, I'm just going to abbreviate that pre-G, preganglionic axon, but a long postganglionic axon. Whereas with sympathetic, it's going to have a long preganglionic axon and a short postganglionic axon. Okay? I'm going to move this up a little bit. All right, and then you've got what neurotransmitter is going to be used. Okay? So you've got the first synapse and you've got the second synapse. And you got the first synapse and you got the second synapse. Okay? So over here at the first synapse, you're going to use acetylcholine. And at the second synapse, you're going to use acetylcholine, okay? However, with the sympathetic division, you will use acetylcholine at the first synapse, but the second synapse is going to use norepinephrine or epinephrine, okay? So this is really kind of narrowing it down for you. And again, you've got all the note slides, but this essentially is something that you need to be writing out multiple times, okay? Let's add some details over here. With this cranial sacral origin, it's going to be associated with several cranial nerves, okay? Specifically, cranial nerve 3, which is your ocular motor, cranial nerve 7, which is your facial, cranial nerve 9, which is your glossopharyngeal, and of course, the most important, the vagus, okay? And then the sacral will obviously be going along with various spinal nerves, okay? Which means over here, it's all going to be traveling with spinal nerves. All right, now just to kind of flesh out our diagram a little bit more, let's just add a couple of examples of things that we'd like to talk about in terms of broad effects. Okay, so over here with the parasympathetic, things that I like to remember is that it helps with constricting the pupil. Okay, so it makes it a smaller. Okay, it's going to do normal secretions for various glands like the lacrimal and the salivary. Okay, this one's important. Reduces your heart rate. Okay, but it helps to increase or at least maintain the secretion of bile and digestive enzymes. So basically, this is the division you're using for normal gut motility and secretion and all of that good stuff, okay? Also defecation, urination, all of that stuff, okay? Now, of course, we all want to talk about sex all the time, right? So let's talk about the role of here. So vasodilation to genitalia, okay? So what this is going to do is help up all of the secretions that are going to occur, okay? Plus also just the feelings of sexual arousal, erection, that kind of stuff, okay? All right, let's see. What are we going to do? Oh, I need to add it over here for the sympathetic. All right, now, right there, see the constricting pupil? Now, sympathetic is going to dilate the pupil. So when someone gets excited, their pupils dilate to let more light in so that they can see the dragon about to chase them, okay? It's going to reduce or shut down glandular secretions, including things for like digestion, because when you're running from a dragon, you do not need to be digesting dinner or peeing, okay? But it's going to increase bronchial dilation, because if you're running from a dragon, you need to be able to bring lots and lots of air into your lungs, okay? So that you can do gas exchange. But that means you also need to increase your heart rate and force. Okay. What else? Oh, sex. We got to get the sex in there. So we're using vasodilation over here for sex, okay, to the genitalia. But over here for sex, it's really going to be the release of the sympathetic innervation that is going to trigger the orgasm or ejaculation. Okay. Okay. that is a pretty good compare and contrast. I think at this point we should probably start flipping through and looking at some of the pictures and seeing how these structures are going together. All right, with this picture, what I want you to notice, so we're looking again at the parasympathetic. We're just going to go back to the beginning. And we're looking at the brainstem where I've got the preganglionic neuron cell bodies right here. And then down here at the sacral region of the spinal cord where I have the preganglionic cell bodies. Okay. And then here you can see that there is a long, actually let's go here. There is a long preganglionic axon. The ganglion is going to be near the target organ where it's going to synapse with the postganglionic axon, and the postganglionic axon is going to be short and go directly to the effector organ, okay? And that is the basic setup for the cranial sacral origin of the parasympathetic. Let's see, I don't think I'm going to add anything with this picture, but it just has more notes right over here, okay? All right, like a lot of my PowerPoints, I've got various note slides, so we've got the various notes here. On the next picture, I'm going to talk about this right here, the three different ways the paravertebral, the three different ways the preganglionic axon is going to synapse with the postganglionic axon. So let's go ahead and see if that's on the next picture and start working through that. Okay. With the sympathetic division, the preganglionic neuron cell bodies are all going to be located in the thoracic and lumbar region of the spinal cord. They are going to have a short preganglionic axon, there will be a synapse, and then there will be a long postganglionic axon going to the target organ. Now we have three pathways, and I'm going to move this over here so I have a little bit more room. Three basic pathways. Let's actually make that a little bit better in terms of how it's going to synapse. Okay, so the first one is directly in the paravertebral ganglionic chain. Okay. So basically you've got your pre right here, it's going to come over to here. Now this is representing the preganglionic chain, okay? In reality, you would have your, basically your spinal cord here, and then your aorta would be right in front of it, okay, in front of the bone. And then you would have your nerves coming out like this, okay? The paravertebral ganglionic chain is literally located right along the edges, okay? They are representing it here, kind of further off to the side, and you're just going to have to deal with that, okay? So this is the pre, so we're going to show the preganglionic axon. It's going to come into the paravertebral ganglionic chain where there are lots and lots of ganglion, okay? It's going to synapse, and then this would be the postganglionic axon, all right, coming out to its target organ, okay? So this is going to be acetylcholine, and then over here it's also going to be using acetylcholine. Okay, excuse me, sorry, not acetylcholine. Either norepinephrine or epinephrine, okay? Then the second pathway, okay, is basically the same, but it can travel up or down the chain. And then synapse. Okay, so say I've got an axon here, it's going to come up here, and then it's going to come up here, synapse there, and then this would be the postganglionic axon going to the target organ. So that's the second pathway, okay? And then the third is going to be the pass-through to the prevertebral ganglionic chain. and the splanchnic system, okay? They form a splanchnic nerve. Okay, so here we've got this. It's going to come up, all right? It's just going to go right through, no synapse, okay? Right through. This is where I've got the yellow right here. This yellow is representing the prevertebral ganglionic chain mess, all right, splanchnic nerve system, okay? So it's going to come in here, and somewhere in here it's going to come in here, and somewhere in here it's going to synapse, and then it's going to go to its target organ. So those are the three major pathways that you're using for this synaptic system, okay? The other thing that's interesting to remember about this particular system is the structure that we studied with the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, how you've got the ventral root, and then the ventral root is going to split into the rest of the nerve. But also, so the ventral ramus and the, sorry, I'm kind of messing this up, how I want to say this. Let me erase that, okay? The ventral root's then going to split into the dorsal root, not the dorsal root, the dorsal ramus, okay? And then the ventral ramus. And then off of that, you've got your rami communicantes. Okay, and this rami communicantes is what's going to give rise to the system that creates the paravertebral ganglionic chain. Okay? All right. So here in this little picture, it's showing you the three pathways and the drawing from the book. Actually, it's from a different book, but at least it's a drawing. So here you've got the origin of the preganglionic neuron going through the anterior horn, the ventral root comes out. So this is the spinal nerve. Now it's going to split into the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. Off the ventral ramus is going to be the rami communicantes. The rami communicantes builds the paravertebral ganglionic chain. This swelling is the ganglion. All right, and so here you can see the axon coming out. It's going to go in here. It's going to synapse. And then it's going to come out and go into that target organ. Okay. Now the second pathway, same thing. The origin is here. It's going to go through. It's going to go through. Oh, it's not going to synapse in the first ganglion it meets. Nope, it's going to go up. Then it's going to synapse. Now I've got a synapse and the postganglionic chain goes out, or the postganglionic axon goes out. Okay. And then down here, this is the third pathway. It comes, here's the origin of the preganglionic neuron, comes out, goes through the ventral root, spinal nerve, ventral ramus, rami communicantes. It is not going to go anywhere with the paravertebral ganglionic chain. It's going to pass through. And then in the prevertebral ganglionic chain, or one of the splanchnic systems, it's going to synapse. And then I will have my postganglionic axon go to the target organ. All right, I think we've got one more slide to talk about. Let's see what we've got. It's a surprise. No, it's not. The adrenal medulla, okay? You're going to study the adrenal gland more in AMP2. But basically, this picture right here is showing you the epithelial cells, which are making hormones. And then in the middle is the neural cells, which are also making a hormone. But this hormone can also be called a neurotransmitter. So hormone versus neurotransmitter. What's the difference? Not much. Both hormones and neurotransmitters, their job is to communicate, all right? They send communications to disparate places, okay? A hormone is going to be communicating with a non-neuron, whereas a neurotransmitter is communicating with another neuron. So norepinephrine and epinephrine, if it's going to your thyroid gland, it's called a hormone. If it's going to some part of your brain, we'll call it a neurotransmitter. Okay, so this is all being made in neurons, literally neurons, all right, in that area. Okay, now with the adrenal gland, this is where we get that huge surge of hormones for the fight, flight, freeze response. Okay, now this directly dumps into the bloodstream. All right, so it doesn't have a classic postganglionic axon. There isn't one. All right, it's just going to go directly into the bloodstream, and that is why it can circulate and get delivered to all over the body so rapidly. Okay? All right, that is the end for part 1. I think part 2 is going to look at visceral reflexes, and you can move on.